and welcome to the Talking Crop Podcast. I'm Kathryn Seebruck, commercial agriculture educator with University of Illinois Extension, serving Daviess-Stephenson-Winnebago counties. Talking Crop is a seasonal crop production podcast with episodes occurring every other week during the growing season between the months of May and September. In each episode, I bring on a guest speaker to discuss topics related to their areas of expertise, as well as what projects they might be working on. In today's episode, I am joined by Daniel Smith, who is the manager of the Nutrient and Pest Management Program with University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dan and I talked about using a winter rye cover crop for weed suppression and soil health building, some of the general economics of cover crops, and some practical advice for implementing cover crops, especially for the shorter growing seasons in northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. And as always, please be sure to evaluate the Talking Crop podcast at the link in the video description below. This only takes a couple of minutes and provides me with really invaluable feedback that I can use to make this podcast a better listening experience for you. Next episode, I will be joined by Dr. Nicholas Sider, who is the Extension Field Crops Entomologist for the Department of Crop Sciences at University of Illinois. And that episode will release on Wednesday, July 10th. With all of that said, please enjoy this episode of Talking Crop, talking winter rye cover cropping with Daniel Smith. So Dan, welcome to the Talking Crop podcast, and thank you so much for taking the time to be here and talk with me today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kathryn. Happy to chat today. I'm Dan Smith, previously the Southwest Regional Agronomist for the University of Wisconsin's Nutrient and Pest Management Program. So I worked a lot with farmers, writing nutrient management plans, handling difficult questions about water hemp management, various weed management questions, herbicide use, controlling troublesome weeds through combine cleaning and reducing weed seed spread, that type of work. Since the first of the year, I moved into a new role though, and on July 1, I become the manager of the Nutrient Pest Management Program. So I'll be in charge of 6 field staff, and I'm very excited to announce that my replacement has been hired, and Landon Baumgartner started just about a week ago, and we're really excited to have him start working with producers in the Driftless region too.
Great. Yeah, that obviously really important work that you were doing in your previous role, and congratulations on your new one. That's awesome. Very well deserved. I know you've done a lot of really great stuff, and we've worked together a little bit in the past. So again, I'm just really glad that you're here and glad that we can continue to network and work together.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
Yeah. So I was gonna first ask you a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing. I know, you were at our agronomy summit this past winter, and you talked about some of the work that you're doing with utilizing no-till and winter rye in corn soy rotation. So could you elaborate on what that work is, like what that project is, kind of the purpose of it, and what you've found in the results?
Yeah, so ever since I started working as an agronomist for the university in the Driftless region, there's been a constant push for no-till adoption and even some cover crop adoption. And that led to a lot of questions. When we moved from a dairy system where we have a fairly heavy focus on growing high quality forages, planting alfalfa into a tilled seed bed is quite common. Planting silage corn, sometimes continuously on say 10 or 15 acres that are relatively flat, close to the barn is fairly common as well. But as we see dairies in Southwest Wisconsin decrease in numbers, we see an increase in grain crops and therefore an increase in erosion oftentimes. So it's really important to try and protect the soil and protect water quality in the Driftless region because of our sloping topography, challenging landscapes, and the introduction to probably a little bit more beef production in our region is advantageous to have more cover crops to save and graze on the landscape. So when I started working in this field, it was really focusing on how do we get more practice adoption on these really challenging acres while improving farm profitability by reducing tillage and improving water quality at the same time by, again, reducing that sediment loss and more importantly, that phosphorus runoff. So there's big challenges though, right? Because everyone typically knows how to till to plant their corn and soybean crops. It's very common in the Midwest to do so. Moving to no-till takes a little bit more time on planter setup. It takes a little bit more advanced weed management scenarios. It also takes more planning. But we have seen phenomenal yields at the Lancaster Research Farm in these no-till systems. So about 2018, we started working on a systems study where we wanted to say, well, if we're going to actually push producers to switch from no-till or switch from tillage to no-till, or even from no-till to a full cover system where we have winter rye on the landscape most of the time in the fall and winter, how do we do this? And what does it look like? So we set out some plots in corn and soybean crop rotations where we had a tillage treatment, a no-till treatment, a winter rye terminated 2 weeks before planting, a winter rye treatment that we terminate at planting. So the same day that we're planting on farm, it could be within 3 or 4 days. We also are comparing that to a rye treatment where we terminate 10 to 14 days after planting, which in corn is really challenging to do, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then we have a rylage harvest. So the rylage harvest is really increasing in popularity. When we first started doing this study, there was a farmer that we interviewed in Southwest Wisconsin that was really interested in using rylage to feed his dairy cows and plant soybeans then into that residue. And this was a kind of a complex crop rotation because they were growing corn silage the previous year, planting rye in, say, early September, because they actually were aiming for a high quality rye crop for that supplemental forage. And then they wanted to plant soybeans by Memorial Day. So it was a really condensed timeline, and they were doing it very successfully. So we modeled what we did in our research trials off of this component this farmer was doing very successfully. And we've done some field days also at this farm. A tremendous example to Southwest Wisconsin on making this work. What we found in chatting with more farmers that are adopting this more frequently is that rylage harvest component is actually of great interest because it's one way that we can make up the economics of the system, produce really high quality feed, and still be able to use that field for something else after the winter annuals and early emerging annual weeds have been suppressed by that rye crop. So there's a lot of interest in it. This year we saw a lot of it. I think we saw some of it done poorly or for straw because it was quite mature when some of that was actually chopped in the landscape. So moving back into the study, we also have a pre-emergent versus no pre-emergent herbicide comparison in that study. We probably won't chat a lot about that today other than the fact that that pre-emergent herbicide is extremely valuable. The rye residue has some interesting interactions with it. I did not do that research. That research is just now released in an extension publication, but there is somewhat of a pre-emergent herbicide interaction with that rye residue that we should be mindful of. But keeping it in the system is really valuable. I just walked that study last Friday, so about 5 days ago, and you can really tell that that pre-emergent herbicide is holding the weeds back in the rylage system. And for kind of a visual comparison for the listeners at home, the treatments that we did not have either rye or a pre-emergent herbicide on had about 85 to 90% weed cover. So about 90% of that plot was covered in weeds and was green. So it looked kind of like a lawn almost from a distance. We had a lot of grass weeds growing along with our troublesome water hemp species. But when we looked at those plots where we treated it with a pre or we had rye residue, the weeds were not present in the pre-emergent herbicide. So that's working as we'd expect. This year we've gotten some really timely rains. In the rye residue treatments, the weeds are maybe a third the size, and there's only about 5 to 10% weed cover at the most. So that rye residue is sticking around. Now, we know from previous years that that rye residue does have a penalty on corn stand and on corn yield, and that's present again this year. We have a little bit of a reduced stand in our rye residue that can be overcome with planter setup and whatnot. We continually work towards improvement for our planter setup every year, but it's still tough to plant corn into that heavy rye residue. Soybeans, they don't care. That's our take-home story. They look really good.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds like a really insightful study. There's a lot of stuff that you're looking at. And I know a couple episodes ago I talked to Aaron Hager and we talked about, the easiest weed to kill. It's easier to kill the smaller it is. So those pre-emergents are really important. But like you've explained using the cover crop. I know a lot of the focus traditionally is on utilizing cover crops for those soil health benefits, but clearly you're looking at it also from that weed suppression benefit. Are you guys, I guess I'll ask then, are you guys looking at any how the cover crop affects soil health at all? Or is it strictly the weed suppression that you're looking at?
Yeah, really, really great question, Kathryn. So this study started, Dr. Rodrigo Worley's lab leads this study, and I've been lucky enough to help lead the Lancaster location and collaborate on this project, help tell our story across the state of Wisconsin to producers about this work. And the original goal was weed management, but we quickly knew that soil health was going to be a big question of this study because of our comparisons and the crop rotation dynamics. So essentially what we did was we reached out to our soil scientist in Wisconsin Extension and said, hey, we have this project. Are you interested in collaborating? And this past year, we had a graduate student, Jacob Felsman, and Dr. Chris Baxter sample every single plot of this study for soil health metrics. They're really interested in aggregate stability, organic matter, and a couple other tests that they're running that are more so in depth into that soil health question. And at the end of the day, there does seem to be some slight changes occurring statistically, not known yet. So there
Hmm.
is some interactions occurring, but are they statistically significant? We don't know yet. It's too early in the study. But what I will say is it's very clear that the soil tilth has changed some in those plots, even after 5 or 6 years being in this study. The soil tilth is a little bit better, and that is more so probably due to not running a field cultivator through those plots every year and packing those down and tearing them up again. So eliminating that tillage is probably a bigger impact than incorporating some of our cover crops at this point. But again, this is a long-term project more than likely, so it's going to take some time to tell that story. So yes, we are working on the soil health metrics, but we just started. And I think that that's just because we're only 5 years in. We did collect baseline data though 5 years ago, so we have that baseline data that we're able to compare to. That was a lot of work. So I thank everyone that was involved in collecting that baseline data. I think there was over 900 pounds of soil that were collected from these sites to begin with, and they're stored in 5-gallon buckets in a freezer. So we're pretty excited to have that data to look back on. But again, moving forward, I think the story will continue to tell itself if we're able to continue this for 10, 15, 20 years in the future. That's still really a young study compared to our agronomic systems in the driftless region, but it will hopefully tell us if we're increasing, say, organic matter, or if we're able to have a little bit better aggregate stability.
Yeah, absolutely. I was gonna ask a question about the study, if it's, is it done? Are there gonna be follow-up studies? But you really answered that question by mentioning how it's gonna be long term. And I found that there's been an interesting shift. There's a lot more studies nowadays that are being planned for long term, which I think is super, super beneficial because between, 2 to 4 years, that's a huge difference. Those results are going to be way different from, a study that goes on 10, 20 plus years. So that'll be really interesting to see how it changes over time. And so with that, since it is a long-term study, you're probably not going to do much changing of this. So are there any like maybe adjacent studies that are being planned based off of what you've seen with this one?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're inspired by the long-term rotational study at Lancaster, which some say is one of the third oldest rotation studies in the Midwest. There's an older one at Michigan, there's an older one at U of I, there's an older one in Arlington, but we think that we're either tied for third with Arlington or just maybe the fourth place there for very long-term research in cropping systems, looking at alfalfa, nitrogen credits, corn nitrogen use, and crop rotations that include some forage crops like oats, and then incorporation of those crops in a rotation. So we're inspired by that work, and we hope to continue this for a long time to answer some complex questions about soil health, about weed management. But a spinoff study that already started was looking at nitrogen rate for planted green corn. And unfortunately, we discontinued that work this year, but we were looking at using the same winter rye seeding date, the same seeding rate, and essentially the same crop rotation to then see what kind of nitrogen rates we should be applying. So are we needing to apply 50 pounds, 100 pounds, 150 pounds, 200 pounds? We were doing a rate study in the same systems so that we could see, well, maybe in the planted green system, we can reduce our nitrogen rate, or maybe we need to front load our nitrogen rate, or maybe we need to apply nitrogen twice. So we were trying to
Hmm.
answer some of those more complex questions. There's a lot more to that story. What I was really blown away by is in a good weather year, so not 2023, we had some really phenomenal yields with some really low nitrogen rates. It was really inspiring to look at that system and see that rye scavenge for nitrogen, hold the nitrogen in place after the soybean crop, and have it ready for that corn crop. Now we have some bigger questions that study was not going to be able to really figure out was when is that nitrogen available to the crop? That's going to take a lot longer time, and I think that's probably going to be the next spin-off study if we could approach that is in these systems, is nitrogen available at a different time in no-till than after winter rye? And I think the assumption is yes, because that winter rye is an added component, but we have no idea when right now. But maybe in the future we will.
Yeah, those sound like really great follow-up questions and follow-up studies. And I know, farmers are going to be really interested to hear about those results. So just really awesome work that you guys are doing. So moving away a little bit from that study, I want to talk, a little bit more broadly about cover crop implementation and, the benefits and all of that. And the big thing, as you are probably very well aware, when you talk to farmers, it boils down to economics, right? And so these soil health benefits and the weed suppression benefits, obviously they're benefits in and of themselves, but are they beneficial from an economic standpoint? So does the cost of implementing a cover crop, does that get paid for by either the weed suppression benefits or the soil health benefits, or, of course, these can be combined as well. Have you guys looked at that, or is that something that you have looked at in the past that you can provide an answer to?
So we haven't crunched the numbers for this study, and I think we should. And that's probably one of those follow-up studies that could be done. I think that there's even enough work there that a graduate student could have that as a thesis project.
Mm-hmm.
Overall, the scientific research is really mixed on the topic. And when I started this work, it was actually quite negative. There was a lot of negativity around the economics because we have to overcome the cost of seeding the cover crop. We
Yep.
have a cover crop survey in Wisconsin where we ask farmers what that cost is to seed the cover crop, and seeding cost alone, just the equipment and the operator, is anywhere from $7 to $10 an acre on a conservative estimate, and the seed is anywhere from $7 to $70. So there's a huge range. So when we look at the lowest number there of, like, say, $14 to $20 an acre, then I don't think that's really too hard to overcome, because the scientific literature says that adding winter rye into your crop rotation is like adding another mode of action for your herbicide program. So
Mm-hmm.
if we're able to grow the same bushels of soybeans in a winter rye cover crop program, we're able to control our weeds with possibly one less tool in the toolbox because of, say, herbicide resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Those costs are quite great. Our herbicide programs for soybeans are quite expensive right now, unfortunately, but we can add winter rye. Still going to need to keep a herbicide in the toolbox unless we do have an alternative way to manage those weeds. We can still look at reducing those and start to pay for that cover crop seed. Now, that just is a pure economics example that any of our ag economists would do at our land grant universities. But when we take it a step further and look at the soil loss from these plots, we think about how much soil we're saving by holding that soil in place with the winter rye, reducing the erosion factors. That's where it gets really interesting, because the cost to replace soil is, of course, anywhere from $80 a ton to priceless, depending on how you look at it. And then we also have to think about all the other factors that go into that soil, that the nutrient value, the value of the soil life that's in that soil. And that's where the economics can get a little bit blurrier, I think. And that's where individual farm management decisions really have to be made. So I think the easiest way to think about this is, if we're going to grow soybeans, we have a choice. We can use herbicides alone in maybe a no-till or a tillage system, and we can rely on those herbicides, and we're going to spend maybe $70 an acre to control our weeds. Or we can think about, well, I'm going to add winter rye into my system, and I'm going to spend, say, $30 an acre on winter rye. I'm going to hopefully be able to still grow the same amount of soybeans, because that's what the University of Wisconsin research from the Wisc Weeds Lab is telling us, is we can grow similar yields in this system, and then I can pay for my herbicide. I can offset my herbicide costs with my rye costs and pay for that seed, and then maybe be ahead a little bit. In corn, the economics still don't make sense based on our research. They only make sense if you're able to grow the corn with reduced inputs in a system that still provides similar yield. So that's why I said it really has to be a farm by farm management decision to really
Mm-hmm.
make that work. I don't see anything wrong with planting corn into winter rye that's either been terminated or terminated at the time of planting. Although at the time of planting in a dry year, we can still see a little bit of a yield decrease. But we have seen systems before where our corn yields are statistically the same from conventional till all the way through that at planting silage harvest. So it's very dependent on the year. So maybe you have an irrigator. Maybe it makes sense to do this all the time because you can control soil moisture. In a drier year, it makes me nervous. But at the same time, I'm very encouraged by the number of farmers that are doing this. And I think that tells us the economics do make sense for them, because they're maybe not having to go back out there and spray another time. They're seeing that time savings alone as being a big deal. So all those factors, Kathryn, I think are really hard to put on paper. And as an academic, it makes it really hard for me to tell the story, because statistics do get a little bit tougher to tell. So I think it's best that the farmers calculate those costs on their own, regardless if they're doing this system or not, because I think that's really important, that the farmers know how much they're spending per acre, know what their profit is, and know if they can do this or not. Does it make sense to buy a new drill or a new air seeder to plant everything to cover crops? Maybe, maybe not. So I think that's really interesting. There's also tremendous cost share. So we didn't touch on that in our economics discussion yet. And oftentimes we're seeing cover crops being paid for entirely by cost share in some counties in Wisconsin by various programs. And then there's a crop insurance rebate in Wisconsin. I believe there's similar programs in Iowa. I have no idea about Illinois, so I apologize for that. But the crop insurance rebate in Wisconsin is $5 an acre. There is some caps and some limitations on it, but essentially you get $5 off your crop insurance per acre, which is a big deal because we're already possibly getting, say, two-thirds of our cover crop program paid for by a program already. So then that helps close that gap significantly. So if we can get our cover crop established for free and reduce a herbicide pass or reduce a tillage pass and reduce both, we're really going to start saving money there. I mean, you start thinking about that, that's $60 an acre pretty easily already if we can save our tillage and herbicide pass. So we think it's very advantageous. I think there's a lot to be known about the true economic value, though, and that's going to probably come from the soil scientists first, and then they're going to have to tell us what the true value of that soil is and that soil biology is.
Yeah, for sure. And you brought up a lot of really great points there, but one that I really resonated with me was that you were talking about how at some point the economics do get a little bit muddier because it's more of those like those non-tangible costs, like you were saying, like building soil. It's really hard to put a number to that, but that's, it's just as important to recognize as a cost saving factor as it is, one less herbicide pass or one less herbicide mode of action being utilized. So that's a really great point that I think sometimes gets, kind of buried in all the information, but it is important to kind of bring to the surface to help people, when they're trying to make these decisions of, do I want to implement this? Is it going to be worth it? And things of that nature.
And one
Um,
more thing to add, Catherine, before
yeah.
we jump into the next question was this year we could really see the erosion happen. So we were
Uh-huh.
tremendously dry last year. The soil is like powdered the last two springs, regardless of how aggressively it was tilled. It was just so dry. Even in our vegetable garden, we planted our vegetable garden last year into powder dry soils that just could blow away. So we
Right.
think about that soils being very prone to erosion. We got the erosion factor this spring. We got tremendous amounts of rain when that soil was ready to be planted, and we saw a lot of erosion occurring. That's very visual, and we can see that soil loss. And that soil loss means that we're losing money from our farm, not alone from us, but for future generations because we can't put that soil back. So I think that's one of the biggest take homes in the driftless region is if we can hold the soil in place, that's an economic cost that we're not having to deal with in the future. Maybe it gets correlated to land value someday. That's purely speculative. But again, I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a bigger deal than what we realize too, is just that what value of holding the soil on the landscape. If you're already no-tilling, maybe not such a big deal.
Right. Yeah, and I'm glad you bring that up too. I mean, because it's not always just water erosion, and it's also wind erosion I've seen as well. I know in Illinois, I think of central Illinois roughly, we've had some dust storms already, and there's that one very famous one that resulted in, some fatal accidents on the highway. And obviously we want to avoid that at all costs. But even up where I'm at, in up here in very north central, northwest Illinois. There were those few days where we had, or it was a couple days where we had really heavy winds, and I'm out walking my dogs, and I'm out in the country, and I can just see these, obviously not a major dust storm, but you can still visually see all that topsoil eroding, via that wind off of the field. So, like you said, whether you realize that or not, that's costly, and especially built up over time, that can have a huge negative effect. Um,
Absolutely.
so yeah, really another really great thing to mention. Um, so something that I hear or have heard from farmers in this area, and obviously I'm south of you, but our areas are not quite that different. And one thing that I've heard a lot is that implementing cover crops after corn is very, very difficult. We're up here in the north. Our growing season is a little bit shorter than, my counterparts down in central and southern Illinois. So do you have anything to say to that? Like, how can a grower, um, kind of factor that in? What can they do so that it's not quite as difficult? What management decisions can they make so that it isn't as much of a struggle and they can still be successful doing this after corn?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the listeners at home, my grandparents actually farm in Northern Illinois, south of where Catherine works. So I totally agree. They plant Wisconsin corn in the areas that drowned out. So that factor of geographic difference in weather conditions is a big deal. But I don't have a worry about it. So at the Lancaster farm, we're very near Illinois and Iowa border. We're about 15, 20 miles from Iowa. We're about probably 30 some miles from Illinois. Much different driving there, of course, but flying there would be an easier story. So when we think about the differences in climate, it is certainly a challenge in the fall that we're thinking about planting a crop when the ground is starting to cool down, possibly getting even some snow. That's a kind of a tough place to be mentally in our cropping system. So it works though. So we planted into nearly frozen ground at the Lancaster Research Farm a few years ago in this system study because we had to. We had to continue
Hmm.
the work because it was in year one of a graduate student's work. We had
Oh,
to
yeah.
had to get the study in the ground, so they had a project to work on, and we didn't know if it would work or not. And the rye didn't come up obviously that fall, but the rye came up just fine the next spring.
Mm.
And some of the rye seed will get ate by predators in the insect world. Some of it will get carried off by wildlife. Some of it won't germinate because it's rotted. But overall, it was a phenomenal stand of cover crops. So being in the great north of Wisconsin for cover crop wise, we see folks planting winter rye well into late November in Wisconsin. And our soils are much cooler than they are in northern Illinois and in central Illinois, especially. And the weather is really interesting to watch. And I do this a lot because I go home a lot, so I watch the weather in both
Hmm.
locations. And we're on average maybe 10 degrees cooler on a day like today in early June or even early July. And that's nice. So instead of 95-degree weather, we have 85-degree weather. But in the
Yeah.
fall, it's not the same extreme. We're lucky that we don't have quite that extreme. And I think that when we look at harvesting dates for corn in northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin, they're really not too different. And as long as we can plant the cover crop before the snow flies, I don't think we can go wrong. Now, in a wet fall, maybe we want to stay out of that field and let things dry out. I know we have had a few years where we would not be able to plant the cover crop because it would have been too wet to go back into those fields. But as far as worrying about a planting date, I'm not worried about it. Now, if you're growing this for grain or if you're growing wheat, absolutely. There's planting dates that you really need to be mindful of to make the economics work in the system. But if you're growing it for a cover crop, keep your costs low. Uh, Grow your own seed, make wise seed purchasing decisions so that if it only 85% of it comes up, you're not out a lot of money. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. The late planting dates don't scare me. And I think what really backs this up is if we look at the amount of growing degree days. So where I grew up, it was usually shortly after Labor Day weekend when crops harvest began. And usually it was with corn. And sometimes corn harvest was done by the first part of October, completely wrapped up. Well, just in Lancaster, just 2.5 hours north of where I grew up, sometimes we're not starting until that time of year. And our growing degree days are much, much less at that point than it would say be in northern Illinois. So if we look at the growing degree maps, we maybe have several hundred to even 1,000 growing degree days left depending on our crop harvest timing in northern Illinois. So I think that's really worth exploring, especially after a small grain or a vegetable crop. I know there's a lot of seed corn grown also in northern Illinois. After all those crops, we have a really good month of growing conditions left in those 2, 3 weeks of September and first 2 weeks of October. That's a 5 week growing season that we should be capitalizing on, getting the cover crop established, and then having a really nice stand of cover crops to plant into the following spring. We've definitely seen that advantage of planting early or in the fall for our cover crop stand in the spring. We saw that big time this year because we planted our rye after our soybean harvest 2 weeks earlier than our corn harvest. We had some equipment logistical concerns. So in small plot research, sometimes things get flipped on when you typically do them on a normal farm, but we got things planted essentially 2 weeks difference this year. And we saw a huge difference. There was maybe a foot difference in biomass because we were able to plant that earlier in the fall. It was able to germinate yet in the fall and get off to a really good start. And I don't see that as anything different than planting things in mid to late September in northern Illinois after an early grain harvest, getting things really well established in the fall. But if it comes down to November 1 and I'm just able to plant my crops then, not really too worried about that either. There's still plenty of good weather left. And then we've just talked about the fall. We haven't talked about the spring yet. The spring weather, we have probably 4 weeks or so of really good spring weather because rye starts growing at a much cooler temperature than corn and soybeans would even germinate at. So we're missing out on those growing degree days early season as well.
Yeah, all really fantastic points and I think very reassuring. Like you said, it can be those are actually decent growing conditions. I think it's hard to separate the growing conditions for our cover crop versus our cash crop, right? So considering that there's going to be a different set of circumstances for each of these crops, and what you might not think is great is actually going to be perfectly fine, even if it is a little late. So, yeah, really great things to keep in mind. Um, while you were speaking, something had popped into my head, and going back a little bit to that weed suppression concept, have you, and forgive me if you mentioned this, but have you guys looked at, comparison of planting density for weed suppression, of your cover crop, or are you doing, just a single rate?
Yeah, so we're just doing a single rate at a bushel per acre in our system study because that was the current recommendation in 2018 was a bushel per acre for a general cover crop. And that was aligned with NRCS and Midwest Cover Crop Council recommendations for cost share practices. That was a standard written into many county programs as well. So that was a planting rate that the growers were familiar with. Now, if I had to do it all over again, I would go to maybe 15 or 20 pounds of rye because I think that you get really good benefits of holding the soil in place and suppressing some weeds at that low rate. That does not align though with the research for weed suppression. So for weed suppression, to have really good weed suppression, we need about 4,000 pounds per acre of biomass or 2 tons of rye biomass. And that's a pretty thick carpet of rye out in the landscape. And that rye is definitely above waist high at termination timing and a typical seeding rate. So that's a lot of rye, but that's providing really good weed suppression in a soybean system. So that's a different system than the person that's wanting to cover crop and start off with planting some rye, holding the soil in place, suppressing some weeds, and not having to change a lot of management things. When you go into 4,000 pounds of biomass, you really have to have your planner dialed in. You have to have the mentality that you're going to get off the tractor, check the planner more than once in that field to ensure that depth is correct. Depth is going to be the biggest issue in that system, making
Mm-hmm.
sure that we're planting deep enough. And then also being patient because the soybeans are going to take a while to come out of the ground. They're going to take a while to look good because that rye is going to be the only thing you see through mid-July with that much biomass out there. But
Right.
come later in the summer, there won't be any weeds or there'll be only a few weed escapes and you'll have a really nice stand of soybeans too. So I think that's a patience game. If you want really good weed suppression, you've got to plant a lot of rye biomass out there. There's also the consideration for crimping. So I think crimping is a very underutilized tool in the driftless region. That's definitely a tool that I would want to work with more, and that is a chemical-free program where we're terminating the rye at Memorial Day or so, full enthesis stage, laying it flat and planting our soybeans into that essentially straw mat
Mm-hmm.
of residue. I think it's a phenomenal system, and the best part is you can buy a crimper for under $10,000 that will do a really good job. You'll have that tool for probably a lifetime if you keep it up. It's just all heavy metal. There's really the only moving part is the drum itself. Very simple tool to have. And when we compare that to herbicide programs, we compare it to different tools that we can buy to manage weeds. It's a really cheap tool to look at. The
Yeah.
sacrifice, though, of course, is planting date. So nobody wants to plant soybeans on Memorial Day because you're going to lose out on yield. Both our land grant institutions have research to back that up. So that's
Mm-hmm.
one consideration as well. Is there's a lot of different tools and a lot of different approaches to getting to that biomass number that you really want. We are doing a statewide survey this spring of cover crop biomass, and I haven't crunched those numbers yet. Our team will look at those this summer and tell us what was actually realistic, and at what date that realistic number was achievable at.
Awesome. Yeah, I think what you mentioned just a few seconds ago about how there are a lot of different tools and there are a lot of different ways of doing things, and I think that's also really reassuring for farmers, especially those who may be on the fence, because as with anything in farming, there's no one size fits all approach, and the fact that there are a lot of options and a lot of different ways of doing things that makes it really customizable and personalizable to an individual's operation. And so with that, kind of to wrap this all up, you know, we hear a lot about, the benefits of cover crops, whether it be soil health, weed suppression, what have you. And there's not there, I mean, there are some downfalls to it in terms of, extra management, potentially extra costs, things of that nature. And so with that, you get a lot of growers who, they haven't implemented this yet, but, they may be seen a neighbor or a friend who's tried it and has been successful. And so now they're kind of on the fence. They move to that middle ground. So what would you say say that would help, kind of push the needle in the direction of, encouraging them to give it a try? So I guess essentially what this question boils down to is, what advice would you give to a grower who is on the fence about trying to implement cover crops for the first time?
Yeah, absolutely. So know your cost of production and your profit per acre, and at what threshold do you break even first. I think there's a lot of times where we get into the habit of doing what we've always done because that's what we know to be profitable. But are we actually profitable? What are our true expenses in that system? Do we have a chisel plow that's 30 years old and needs replacing? That instead of buying a new chisel plow, maybe we buy a new no-till drill and we even do some custom work for the neighbors. So I think starting with our economics on our own farm is the best place to start for step number one. If you've already got that handled, which I know many farmers do, awesome. We can move on to step number two, and that's planting. What I would recommend is winter rye before soybeans. So after we harvest our corn, go out and plant rye into that residue. It could be flown on or aerial applied with a spreader. The stand may or may not work out. So I've seen that done very successfully. I've also seen it done very poorly. Work with your trusted agronomist to figure out the best plan for seeding. If you can no-till, drill that seed in, I think that's the gold standard. Now, I know in Northern Illinois, we're often dealing with 80-acre and above parcels, and a 15-foot no-till drill that we see commonly in Wisconsin is just not going to be the best tool. So maybe you have a neighbor that has a 30-foot no-till drill and they do custom seeding. That might be cheaper than what you can possibly ever think about doing it yourself for, because they already have the equipment. Maybe you give them the tractor and the fuel, that type of thing, or even the operator to use for the day. I think all those innovative seeding practices should be evaluated as well in the system. But once we get our rye out there on the landscape after our corn grain, we're going to plant soybeans into that. And I'm going to push you to plant it green because it's not that complicated. We're going to wait until, say, mid-May, early May, mid-May, depending on climate conditions. We're not going to sacrifice a lot of yield by doing this. We want to be mindful of planting date. We're continually pushing to plant soybeans early, but we're going to pick a mindful planting date, and we're going to pick a day where our temperatures are above 40 degrees at night and 50 degrees during the day for 3 days. We're going to terminate that rye, say at planting. Plant our soybeans. We're going to ensure that our planting depth is proper and that we're getting a good population of soybeans planted, and we're going to watch that field for the rest of the year. And we're going to start small. We're going to do this on one field. We're not going to do 1,200 acres of this the first year unless you're really confident you have some neighbors that have taught you how to do this, that type of thing. So we're going to start small. We're going to watch that field and keep an eye on it. Everyone in the neighborhood is going to be really interested in that one field, especially in Northern Illinois. I did see some cover crop fields that looked great this year in my drives back and forth, but keep an eye on it. We're going to learn a lot from that field. We're going to see what kind of insects come into that field. We see a lot of beneficial insects coming into the fields that we're working on. I just scouted with an entomologist early season in our fields. That was an interesting dynamic as a weed scientist that I didn't fully understand. We're also going to see what kind of weeds emerge. So what kind of weed population did we have in that field, and what population do we have now that weed population is being held back by that biomass? And then we're going to harvest that field, and we're going to say, well, maybe those were fairly profitable soybeans, or maybe they weren't. But if we don't crunch the numbers on that field, we're never going to know for sure. So after we take that small field to yield, really want to crunch the numbers and see how we did. See what kind of cost you saved, see how much time you saved on that field before further adoption. Now, if you've already done that and say, well, gosh, I really like that, then move into corn. But remember that we're recommending that the rye is terminated before the corn is planted. That way you don't have that biomass interaction that does decrease corn yield in some years. In a dry year, I would do neither. I would terminate as early as possible in a dry year. But again, you've got to have some sense of your local conditions too. If it just looks like it's going to be dry for a week or two, that is really not going to matter. But if it's going to be dry for an extended period of time and your soil conditions are already dry, so the 10-day forecast says no rain, your soil conditions are already dry, that's at the point where I'm thinking we need to terminate this rye and make sure we can plant a cash crop as successfully without that competition. But those are all factors down the road. So we've kind of gone through the soybean, the corn ear. The corn ear, we're going to have just a small mat of biomass. You're really not going to notice anything different. Scout that field frequently because you will have some weeds emerge through that rye biomass. And then again, take that field to yield, crunch the numbers on it, and think about what you can do differently. Step three in this whole system, so we've thought about our economics, we've gone through our 2 crop rotations. Step three is thinking about your planting equipment again. So on your corn planter, after you've done this for a successful season, what could you do different? What could you improve? what have you not maybe maintained in the last few seasons? How could you make that the best piece of equipment possible? Because we really see this, the failure of these systems start with the planting equipment.
Right. Yeah. Dan, that was all really great information. I find myself listening to a lot of presentations about implementing cover crops and the benefits and all of this, but a lot of the time I think what growers find is that there's no, kind of stepwise, process of what do I do? So here's all this background information and now what? So I really appreciate you going through that. And I think, growers will appreciate that as well. And it's a really good place to start. Like you said, start small, crunch the numbers, know what you're going into and what you're getting out of it. That's really, really great. So Dan, thank you so much for being here today. Before we go, I just wanted to ask, is there anything that you want to let the audience know about in terms of, any events coming up, things of that nature that they might be interested in attending or knowing about?
Yeah, absolutely. So 2023 was our inaugural year for a Water and Soil Health Conference in Wisconsin. So we have the WASH Conference, Wisconsin Water and Soil Health Conference. It's December 17th and 18th in the Wisconsin Dells. So really not that far away from Illinois. We're going to be at the Kalahari Resort for 2 days. We've got 3 really big name keynotes that we're working on, finalizing the details on. We're also working on about 9 breakout sessions that farmers are going to be able to go to and learn about all the things we talked about today, but they're also going to learn about why it's really important to reduce water movement from their farm to hold phosphorus in place. What are the overall impacts of managing soil health and water quality together? What are some of those economic implications? So really kind of a holistic conference on a lot of regenerative ag topics, also focusing on water quality. So we're really proud of our event. Last year we had 375 attendees. The majority were farmers. We did have a few Illinois farmers come up to it. We'd love to see more come up to that conference. Take a couple days in December. I'm sure the Wisconsin farmers will joke about how the Illinois farmers aren't doing much anyways as grain farmers in December. So it's a great event though, and we're very fortunate to continue hosting it, and very fortunate that we have so many people come. And it's really quite kind of a social activity too. There's a lot of in between the session times that farmers are just sharing ideas, sharing thoughts, sharing success stories. So it's really fun.
Great. That sounds like a fantastic event. And in the video description, I will include any information about that I can that you give me, Dan. So we'll be ready for that once we end our conversation here. But again, thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed this conversation and appreciate all the knowledge that you've brought. And we'll speak soon, I'm sure.
Sounds great. Thank you.